The Gilded Arrangement. Chapter 1. The Ultimatum. The mahogany conference table gleamed under the crystal chandelier as Marcus Hartwell sat rigidly in his chair, watching his father's weathered hands fold across a stack of legal documents. The familiar scent of his grandfather's pipe tobacco still lingered in the air of the Hartwell estate's study, though the old man had been gone for 3 years now. 6 months, Charles Hartwell said, his voice carrying the weight of 4 generations of shipping empire legacy. You have 6 months to marry Vivian Sterling, or the company goes to your cousin Theodore. Marcus's jaw tightened. Theodore couldn't run a lemonade stand, let alone Hartwell shipping lines. And if I refuse? Then you'll have the satisfaction of your principals and a monthly allowance that wouldn't cover the maintenance on your sports car. His father's steel-gray eyes held no warmth. The Sterling merger is worth hundreds of millions, son. Your romantic notions are not. 15 miles across the city, Vivian Sterling paced the length of her mother's opulent sitting room, her heels clicking against imported Italian marble. The afternoon sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting golden light across oil paintings worth more than most people's houses. Darling, you're being theatrical, Eleanor Sterling sighed, not looking up from her crystal tumbler of afternoon gin. It's a perfectly suitable arrangement. The Hartwell boy is handsome enough, well-educated, and from good family. The Hartwell boy doesn't even know me. Vivian stopped pacing, her emerald dress swirling around her legs. Mother, I've dreamed of falling in love since I was old enough to understand what marriage meant. I want someone who makes my heart race, who will leave you penniless when he runs off with his secretary. Eleanor finally looked up, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows arched. Love is a luxury, Vivian. Security is a necessity. Your father and I have built something lasting here. The Sterling Hotel empire will span continents after this merger. Vivian sank into a velvet armchair, her stomach churning. And if I say no, then you'll discover how far $25,000 a year stretches in the real world. Eleanor's smile was sharp as cut glass. Though I hear Marcus Hartwell is quite the gentleman. He'll probably allow you to keep some of your jewelry. That evening, Marcus stood at his penthouse window overlooking the harbor, watching ships navigate between the lights that dotted the water like fallen stars. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. Miss Sterling has agreed to dinner tomorrow. Reservation confirmed at Le Bernardin, 8 p.m. He'd met Vivian Sterling exactly twice, once at a charity gala 3 years ago where she'd laughed too loudly and danced until dawn, and once at a business dinner where she'd spent the evening on her phone, presumably coordinating her next social adventure. The idea of spending his life with someone so frivolous made his chest tighten with dread. But Theodore would destroy everything his great-grandfather had built. The choice, Marcus realized with bitter clarity, had already been made. Across town, Vivian stared at her reflection in her vanity mirror, surrounded by photographs of herself at gallery openings, charity events, and late-night adventures with friends who would likely scatter the moment her trust fund disappeared. Her phone buzzed constantly with invitations to parties, club openings, weekend getaways, to the Hamptons, a glittering life that suddenly felt as fragile as spun glass. She thought of the romance novels hidden in her nightstand, of the dreams she'd nursed since childhood of finding someone who would see past her family's money to the woman beneath. Someone who would choose her, not her bank account. Tomorrow she would meet Marcus Hartwells and begin the process of selling those dreams for the price of financial security. The die, as her father would say, was cast. Marcus loosened his tie as he walked through his penthouse, the weight of the evening's conversation settling on his shoulders like a familiar burden. He poured himself 2 fingers of scotch and stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. The lights of the Hartwell shipping fleet twinkled in the distance, a legacy 4 generations in the making, now dependent on his willingness to marry a woman he barely knew. He thought of his grandfather's stories about building the company from a single cargo ship, about the sacrifices required to create something lasting. "Duty before desire, boy," the old man used to say. "That's what separates the men from the children." But even his grandfather had married for love. Marcus had seen the letters his grandmother kept, passionate declarations written during the war. What would the old man say about this cold transaction masquerading as marriage? Meanwhile, Vivian kicked off her designer heels and curled up on her silk sofa, pulling a cashmere throw around her shoulders. The weight of her mother's words echoed in the spacious apartment. Love is a luxury. Security is a necessity. She reached for her phone and scrolled through photos from last weekend's charity gala, pausing on one of herself dancing with David Morrison, a pediatric surgeon who made her laugh and asked nothing of her except her company. They'd talked until sunrise about books and travel, about his work saving children and her dreams of opening an art gallery. For a brief, shining moment, she'd thought maybe, but David would never be approved by her family. His salary, while respectable, wouldn't even cover the maintenance on her mother's jewelry collection. Tomorrow night, she would sit across from Marcus Hartwell and pretend to be interested in a man whose idea of romance probably involved prenuptial agreements and tax advantages. The thought made her stomach twist with something between dread and grief. Chapter 2. Reluctant Courtship. Le Bernardin hummed with the quiet sophistication of New York's culinary elite. Marcus arrived precisely at 8, his navy suit impeccable, his expression carefully neutral. He'd chosen the restaurant for its reputation and discreet atmosphere somewhere their inevitable awkwardness wouldn't provide entertainment for gossip columnists. Vivian was already seated at their corner table, and Marcus paused in recognition. Gone was the party girl from the society pages. Tonight, she wore a simple black dress that somehow managed to be both elegant and understated, her dark hair pulled back in a classic chignon. She looked up as he approached, and he caught a flash of something vulnerable in her green eyes before her social mask slipped back into place. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "How punctual of you. Miss Sterling?" Her handshake was firm, confident, not what he'd expected. "I hope you haven't been waiting long." "Only long enough to order wine." She gestured to the bottle of Chablis breathing beside the table. "I assumed you'd prefer something sensible." There was an edge to her tone that made him study her more carefully. "You assumed correctly." They ordered their meals with the stilted politeness of strangers at a business dinner, which Marcus supposed was exactly what this was. When the sommelier retreated, an uncomfortable silence settled between them. "So," Vivian said finally, taking a sip of wine, "shall we discuss terms? I assume you have thoughts about how this arrangement should proceed." Marcus had prepared for this conversation, but her directness caught him off guard. "I believe we should be honest about our expectations." "How refreshing!" Her smile was sharp. "Most men spend the first few dates pretending they're not calculating my net worth." "I'm not most men." "No," she agreed, studying him over her wine glass. "Most men have at least pretended to find me charming." Despite himself, Marcus felt his lips twitch. "Perhaps I'm waiting to be charmed." For a moment, something real flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe even amusement. But it vanished quickly. "I doubt that. You've already decided I'm frivolous and inappropriate. I can see it in the way you're sitting, like you're afraid I might spontaneously combust into glitter." The observation was so accurate that Marcus nearly choked on his water. "I don't—" "Please!" Vivian waved a dismissive hand. "I've been judged by men like you my entire life, serious men who think enjoying life is somehow morally deficient. And I suppose you've already decided I'm a cold, controlling bore who schedules his emotions." "Don't you?" The question hung between them, neither accusation nor mockery, just genuine curiosity. Marcus considered lying, maintaining the professional distance he'd cultivated. Instead, he found himself saying, Tuesday evenings, 7 to 7:30. Melancholy is Thursdays after lunch. Vivian's startled laugh was nothing like the tinkling sound he'd heard at parties. It was rich, genuine, completely unguarded. What about joy? When do you schedule that? Still working on fitting it into the calendar. She studied him for a long moment, her head tilted slightly. You're not quite what I expected either. Their appetizers arrived, providing a reprieve from the intensity of the conversation. Marcus watched as Vivian examined her dish with obvious pleasure, asking the server about the preparation with genuine interest. She wasn't performing for anyone. She simply enjoyed the experience of fine dining. "My mother thinks you're perfect for me," Vivian said once they were alone again. "Stable, responsible, unlikely to run off with the household silver. Your mother has low expectations. She has practical expectations." Vivian's voice grew quiet. "She married my father for love, you know. Spent the first 10 years of their marriage terrified he'd leave her for someone more sophisticated. When his business took off, she made sure she became indispensable in other ways." Marcus found himself leaning forward despite his intention to maintain distance. "And now? Now they have separate bedrooms and communicate through their assistants." Vivian met his eyes. "But they have a very successful marriage. By their standards." The weight of her words settled between them. Marcus thought of his own parents, whose relationship functioned like a well-oiled corporate merger efficient, profitable and utterly devoid of warmth. "What do you want?" he asked suddenly. The question seemed to surprise her. From this marriage? From life? Vivian was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I want someone to choose me. Not my trust fund, not my family's connections, not what I can do for them, just me." The honesty in her admission hit him like a physical blow. Marcus had spent so long focusing on duty and obligation that he'd almost forgotten what wanting something for yourself felt like. "I want to build something lasting," he said, surprising himself with his own honesty. "Something that matters beyond quarterly profits and board meetings. I thought I wanted it alone, but lately—" He trailed off, uncertain how to finish. "Lately you've wondered if alone is just another word for empty?" Their eyes met across the table, and for a moment Marcus saw past her careful composure to the lonely woman beneath. He suspected she was seeing something similar in him. "We're quite a pair," Vivian said softly. "The woman who's never been chosen, and the man who's forgotten how to choose." Marcus raised his wine glass. "To honest expectations, then." Vivian touched her glass to his, the crystal chiming softly in the intimate space between them. "To finding something real in an arrangement that's anything but." As they settled into discussing practical matters, timeline, living arrangements, public appearances, Marcus found himself watching the way Vivian's face animated when she talked about something she cared about. And despite his better judgment, despite every rational thought in his head, he began to wonder what it would be like to be the reason for that kind of passion. Across the table, Vivian was having similar thoughts, noticing how Marcus's careful composure softened when he spoke about his sister, about preserving his family's legacy not for profit, but for the people who depended on it. Perhaps, she thought, there was more to Marcus Hartwell than quarterly reports and duty. Perhaps there was hope for them both. The evening ended with a formal handshake and an agreement to meet again in 3 days. Neither mentioned the moment when their carefully maintained distance had cracked, revealing two people who might, under different circumstances, have actually liked each other. Walking to their respective cars, both Marcus and Vivian found themselves wondering if different circumstances might be exactly what they were creating. Chapter 3. The Loveless Wedding. 6 weeks later, St. Patrick's Cathedral was transformed into a fairy tale setting that felt more like a beautiful prison. White roses cascaded from every surface, their perfume heavy in the air as Manhattan's elite filled the ancient pews. Camera flashes sparkled like stars, as society photographers captured what the press had dubbed the wedding of the decade. Vivian stood in the cathedral's bridal suite, staring at her reflection in an antique mirror. The Vera Wang gown was a masterpiece of silk and French lace, custom designed to photograph perfectly from every angle. Her mother had insisted on the cathedral despite Vivian's preference for something smaller, more intimate. "This wedding isn't about what you want," Eleanor had said. "It's about what the merger requires." "You look beautiful," whispered her maid of honor, Sophia, adjusting the cathedral veil that had belonged to 4 generations of sterling women. "Like a princess in a fairy tale." "Fairy tales end with true love," Vivian replied softly, her hands trembling as she touched the diamond necklace at her throat. Marcus's wedding gift, presented to her the night before, with the same ceremony one might use to transfer corporate assets. "This feels more like Persephone being dragged to the underworld. Maybe Hades will surprise you," Sophia said gently. He seemed different at the rehearsal dinner, more human. Vivian remembered the previous evening, how Marcus had actually smiled when her young nephew had spilled grape juice on his designer tuxedo. For a moment, she'd glimpsed the man he might be when he wasn't performing the role of dutiful heir. But moments weren't enough to build a marriage on. The cathedral doors opened with ceremonial weight, and the processional began. Vivian walked down the endless aisle on her father's arm, her smile perfect and hollow as she nodded to faces she'd known since childhood. At the altar, Marcus waited in morning dress, looking every inch the successful businessman about to close his most important deal. When their eyes met, she saw her own mixture of resignation and determination reflected back at her. They were 2 actors playing their parts in a script written by others, and both knew it. "Dearly beloved," the Archbishop began, his voice echoing in the soaring space, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Marcus Charles Hartwell and Vivian Elizabeth Sterling." The ancient words washed over them, beautiful and meaningless. Marcus spoke his vows with the same precision he used in boardroom presentations. Vivian responded with the grace of someone who'd been trained since childhood to perform on command. When Marcus slipped the platinum wedding band onto her finger, his touch was gentle but impersonal, like a doctor conducting an examination. "You may kiss the bride." The kiss was chaste, appropriate, completely devoid of passion. The cathedral erupted in applause and camera flashes, but Vivian felt nothing except the weight of the ring that now bound her to a stranger. The reception at the plaza was a testament to both families' wealth and influence. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across tables adorned with orchids flown in from Thailand. The 8-course dinner featured delicacies from around the world, accompanied by wines that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Marcus and Vivian sat at the head table like royalty, smiling and nodding as guest after guest offered congratulations that felt more like condolences. They danced their first dance to "The Way You Look Tonight," moving together with practiced elegance while maintaining careful distance. "Smile," Marcus murmured as they swayed to the music. "Your mother is taking photos." "I am smiling," Vivian replied through gritted teeth. "That's your charity luncheon with people I despise. Smile. I've seen the photos." Despite herself, Vivian's lips twitched. "You've studied my smiles?" "Market research," Marcus said dryly. "I needed to know what I was getting into." "And what's your analysis?" "You have 17 different smiles. This is number 12, polite interest masking complete boredom." Vivian looked up at him, startled by his observation. "You're more perceptive than I gave you credit for." "Don't sound so surprised. I didn't build a shipping empire by missing important details." "Is that what I am? An important detail?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You're my wife," he said finally. "That makes you the most important detail of all." The song ended, and they were immediately separated by well-wishers and photographers. For the rest of the evening, they played their parts perfectly. the devoted newlyweds, grateful for everyone's presence, blissfully happy to begin their life together. But as the night wore on, Vivian found herself watching Marcus from across the room. He moved through the crowd with easy confidence, remembering names, asking about children and grandchildren, making even the most social conversations seem genuine. This was his world, she realized, not just the wealth, but the responsibility that came with it. Every handshake was a commitment, every conversation a negotiation for the greater good of the businesses and families that depended on him. When he caught her looking, he raised his champagne glass slightly in her direction. She raised hers in response, and for a moment, they were conspirators rather than prisoners. The honeymoon suite at the plaza was decorated with white roses and champagne on ice, a romantic tableau that only emphasized the chasm between expectation and reality. Marcus loosened his tie as Vivian kicked off her shoes, both of them suddenly aware that the performance was over and they were alone. "Well," Vivian said, settling onto the silk sofa with her champagne, "we did it." "Indeed." Marcus poured himself a scotch from the crystal decanter. "Your mother looked pleased. Your father looked relieved. Both achieved their objectives." Marcus sat in the armchair across from her, maintaining careful distance. "The merger paperwork will be finalized Monday morning." They sat in silence, the weight of their new reality settling around them like dust. Outside the windows, Manhattan glittered with possibilities they would never explore together. "I've arranged for separate bedrooms in the estate," Marcus said quietly. "I thought, given the circumstances—" "Thank you," Vivian replied, relief evident in her voice. "I appreciate your consideration." "This doesn't have to be more difficult than necessary," Marcus continued. "We can maintain our respective lives while fulfilling our obligations to our families." Vivian nodded, but something in her chest ached at his words. She'd spent her whole life being someone's obligation, her parents, her society friends, various disappointed suitors. She'd hoped that marriage, even an arranged one, might offer something more. "Separate but equal," she said, raising her glass. "To a modern marriage." Marcus touched his glass to hers, but neither took much satisfaction in the toast. They were bound together now, but it felt more like parallel imprisonment than partnership. Later, as Vivian lay alone in the enormous bed, still wearing her wedding dress because she couldn't bring herself to ask Marcus to help with the buttons, she stared at the ceiling and wondered if this hollow ache in her chest was what her mother called growing up. In the sitting room, Marcus sat by the window until dawn, still in his wedding attire, watching the city wake up and wondering when duty had become such a cold companion. Tomorrow, they would fly to Paris for their honeymoon. A week of playing the happy couple for photographers and gossip columnists, maintaining the illusion that love had triumphed over practicality. But tonight, in the quiet aftermath of their beautiful, empty wedding, both Marcus and Vivian faced the truth. They had gotten exactly what their families wanted, and nothing that they needed. Chapter 4. Escalating Conflicts. 3 months into their marriage, the Hartwell estate had become a battleground disguised as domestic tranquility. The Georgian mansion sat on 12 acres of manicured grounds in the Hamptons, its 40 rooms providing ample space for 2 people to avoid each other completely. Marcus had claimed the East Wing as his domain office, library, and master bedroom arranged with military precision. Vivian had taken refuge in the West Wing, transforming the morning room into an art studio and filling her bedroom with the kind of vibrant colors that made Marcus wince. Their housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, had begun leaving subtle signs of her disapproval around the house breakfast settings for 1 single placemats instead of pairs, dinner invitations addressed to Mr. Hartwell with no mention of his wife. The staff, hired to maintain a family home, instead found themselves managing what felt more like an upscale boarding house for 2 strangers who happened to share a last name. "Mrs. Hartwell won't be joining you for breakfast again?" Mrs. Chen asked one Tuesday morning, her tone carefully neutral as she set Marcus's coffee beside his morning papers. Marcus didn't look up from the Wall Street Journal. Mrs. Hartwell keeps her own schedule. What he didn't say was that Vivian's schedule had become increasingly erratic and, in his opinion, increasingly irresponsible. She'd thrown herself into Manhattan's social scene with a vengeance, attending gallery openings that ran until midnight, charity galas that ended at dawn, and private parties in Tribeca lofts that he was certain involved more than just champagne and conversation. Last week, she'd stumbled home at 6 in the morning wearing someone else's jacket over her evening gown, her hair disheveled and her eyes bright with the kind of reckless energy that made Marcus's jaw clench. She'd offered no explanation, simply nodded politely, and disappeared into her wing of the house like a beautiful ghost. The society pages had begun to notice. "The new Mrs. Hartwell seems to be enjoying her freedom," one gossip columnist had written, accompanying the observation with a photo of Vivian dancing at some underground club in Brooklyn, surrounded by artists and musicians who looked like they'd never seen a trust fund. Perhaps married life agrees with her more than expected. Marcus had read the column 3 times, studying the photograph with the intensity he usually reserved for shipping manifests. Vivian looked genuinely happy not performing, not maintaining her social mask, just laughing with abandon as some tattooed photographer spun her around the dance floor. When was the last time he'd seen her laugh like that? When was the last time anyone had spun him around a dance floor? The thought irritated him more than it should have. Meanwhile, Vivian was having her own struggles with their arrangement. She'd expected Marcus to be cold and controlling, but she hadn't expected him to be so completely indifferent to her existence. They crossed paths perhaps twice a week, usually in the marble foyer as one of them was leaving and the other returning. Their conversations consisted entirely of polite inquiries about each other's health and schedule adjustments communicated through Mrs. Chen. "Mr. Hartwell will be hosting a business dinner Thursday evening," the housekeeper informed her one afternoon as Vivian painted in her makeshift studio. "He's requested that you join them." Vivian's brush paused mid-stroke. "Requested or required?" "He used the word appropriate," Mrs. Chen said diplomatically. Of course he had. Everything with Marcus was about what was appropriate, suitable, expected. Vivian had spent 3 months waiting for him to show even a flicker of interest in who she was beyond her role as the perfect corporate wife. Instead, he seemed content to have her exist as an attractive accessory, wheeled out for special occasions and otherwise ignored. Thursday's dinner was a perfect example. 8 shipping executives and their wives gathered in the formal dining room, discussing quarterly projections and market fluctuations, while Vivian smiled and nodded at conversations about children she didn't have, and charity committees she'd never joined. Marcus played the perfect host, charming and attentive to everyone except his own wife. "Your husband is quite the catch," whispered Patricia Morrison, wife of the fleet manager, as the men retired to Marcus's study for cigars and brandy. "So distinguished, so focused. My Harold could learn a thing or two about ambition." Vivian smiled her number 12 smile, polite interest, masking complete boredom. If Patricia only knew how much ambition could cost, how it could turn a man into a beautiful statue that looked like husband but felt nothing like one. That night, after the guests had gone and Marcus had disappeared into his study to review contracts, Vivian stood in her bedroom window looking out at the estate grounds. The gardens were perfectly maintained, every hedge trimmed to geometric precision, every flower bed arranged in symmetrical patterns. It was beautiful, expensive, and utterly lifeless. She grabbed her purse and keys. Marcus heard her car start at nearly midnight. From his study window, he watched her Mercedes disappear down the tree-lined drive, its taillights swallowed by darkness. Where did she go during these late-night excursions? What did she find in those downtown clubs and gallery spaces that she couldn't find in their $60 million home? The question bothered him more than he cared to admit. He'd married Vivian, expecting her to be frivolous and high-maintenance, but willing to play the role of society wife in exchange for financial security. Instead, she seemed determined to prove that marriage hadn't tamed her rude streak. If anything, it had amplified it. Every late night, every society page photo, every morning she slept until noon felt like a deliberate challenge to his authority. What he didn't understand was why it felt so much like rejection. Marcus poured himself another scotch and returned to his contracts. But the numbers swam on the page. Somewhere in Manhattan, his wife was probably dancing with strangers, laughing with people who appreciated her spontaneity, instead of seeing it as a character flaw. He told himself he didn't care, that her behavior reflected on her rather than him, that their arrangement gave them both the freedom to live separate lives. But when Vivian finally came home at dawn, Marcus was still awake, still listening for her footsteps in the hallway that led to the wing of the house he was never invited to enter. The explosion came on a Friday evening in late November. Marcus arrived home from a particularly difficult board meeting to find Vivian in the foyer, dressed in a stunning red gown that probably cost more than most people's cars. She was checking her reflection in the antique mirror, applying lipstick with the careful precision of someone preparing for battle. "Going out?" he asked, though the answer was obvious. "The Morrison Gallery is opening a new exhibition," she said without turning around. "Contemporary artists, very avant-garde. You wouldn't enjoy it." Something in her dismissive tone snapped his carefully maintained composure. "How would you know what I'd enjoy? You've never bothered to ask." Vivian turned to face him, her green eyes flashing. "Because I know men like you, Marcus. You enjoy quarterly reports and board meetings and conversations about market volatility. You enjoy things that can be measured and controlled and filed away in neat little categories. And you enjoy making a spectacle of yourself in nightclubs while photographers document your every move for the gossip pages." "At least I'm living," she shot back. "At least I'm not hiding in this mausoleum pretending that duty is an adequate substitute for a life. This mausoleum is your home. These duties are what keep you in designer gowns and luxury cars." "I never asked for any of this." The words exploded out of her, months of frustration finally finding voice. "I never asked to be trapped in a marriage to a man who treats me like an expensive piece of furniture. I never asked to spend my life being appropriate and suitable and perfectly behaved while slowly dying inside." Marcus stared at her, stunned by the raw pain in her voice. For a moment, he saw past her anger to the lonely woman beneath, and something twisted in his chest. But then his own frustration surged forward. "And I never asked to be married to a woman who finds our life together so unbearable that she has to escape it every night. Do you have any idea what people are saying? What your behavior is doing to both our reputations?" "Our reputations?" Vivian's laugh was sharp and bitter. "You mean your reputation? St. Marcus, the dutiful son who married the wild Sterling girl and couldn't manage to tame her. How embarrassing for you." "That's not what I meant." "Isn't it?" She stepped closer, her eyes blazing. "You married me because you needed a wife to complete your perfect corporate image. You didn't want a partner. You wanted an accessory. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I'm not willing to disappear just to make your life more comfortable." The accusation hit too close to home. Marcus felt his own anger rising, cold and controlled. "And you married me because you needed money to maintain your lifestyle. At least I'm honest about what this arrangement is." "What this arrangement is," Vivian said quietly, "is two people slowly destroying each other because we're too proud to admit we both got exactly what we deserved." She swept past him toward the door, her red gown trailing behind her like spilled wine. At the threshold, she turned back. "Don't wait up," she said. "I have a life to live, even if you don't approve of it." The door closed behind her with a soft click that somehow felt louder than a slam. Marcus stood alone in the foyer, surrounded by ancestral portraits and fresh flowers and all the trappings of a successful life, and wondered when everything had gone so completely wrong. Outside, Vivian sat in her car for a full 5 minutes before starting the engine, her hands shaking with adrenaline and unshed tears. She'd said too much, revealed too much, but she couldn't regret the honesty. At least now they both knew where they stood. As she drove toward the city, neither she nor Marcus realized that their first real fight had also been their first real conversation, and that sometimes you have to break something completely before you can begin to build it back together. Chapter 5. The Breaking Point. The holidays passed in a blur of obligatory appearances and carefully choreographed politeness. Christmas dinner at the Sterling estate, New Year's Eve at the Hartwell family gathering. Marcus and Vivian played their parts with Oscar-worthy precision, presenting a united front while privately counting the hours until they could retreat to their separate corners of existence. But January brought a new level of recklessness to Vivian's behavior that even she recognized as dangerous. It started with missing a charity luncheon she'd promised to attend, then escalated to showing up late and slightly drunk to her mother's birthday dinner. The gossip columnists were having a field day, and even Sophia had begun expressing concern. "You're scaring me, Viv," her best friend said over coffee at their usual cafe. "This isn't like you, isn't it?" Vivian stirred sugar into her latte with mechanical precision. "Maybe this is exactly like me." And everyone just preferred the version that smiled and stayed quiet. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night in mid-January. Marcus had spent the day in emergency meetings trying to salvage a shipping contract that had gone south, dealing with union disputes and insurance complications that threatened to cost the company millions. He'd worked until nearly midnight, surviving on coffee and determination, looking forward to nothing more than a quiet scotch and an early night. Instead, he came home to find photographers camped outside the estate gates. Mrs. Chen met him at the door, her usually composed face tight with worry. "Mrs. Hartwell hasn't returned home, sir. She went out yesterday evening and—" She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "And? There was an incident at a nightclub in Manhattan. The police were called. Nothing serious," she added quickly. "But the photographers have been gathering since this morning." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What kind of incident?" Mrs. Chen handed him her tablet, displaying a gossip website. The headline screamed, "Hartwell Heiress in Nightclub Brawl." Below it, a series of grainy photos showed Vivian in a silver dress, apparently arguing with someone outside a Tribeca club. In one image, she was being restrained by a bouncer. In another, she appeared to be shouting at a group of photographers. Marcus read the article with growing disbelief. According to witnesses, Vivian had been drinking heavily when she'd gotten into an altercation with another patron, who'd made some comment about trust fund princesses. The situation had escalated when photographers arrived, and Vivian had apparently thrown her drink at one of them before being escorted out by security. "Where is she now?" Marcus asked quietly. "I believe she's staying with Miss Rodriguez," Mrs. Chen replied. "She called this morning to say she was safe, but wouldn't be coming home today." Marcus stared at the photos, feeling a mixture of fury and something else he couldn't quite identify. The woman in these pictures looked nothing like the composed socialite he'd married. This Vivian looked desperate, wild, like someone drowning and lashing out at anyone who came too close. He found her at Sophia's apartment in Soho the next evening, after a day of damage control that had left him exhausted and frustrated. Sophia answered the door with a wary expression, clearly prepared for a fight. "She doesn't want to see you," Sophia said bluntly. "I don't care what she wants," Marcus replied. "We need to talk, now." He pushed past Sophia into the living room, where Vivian sat curled on the couch in jeans and an oversized sweater, looking younger and more fragile than he'd ever seen her. There was a small bruise on her left cheek, and her eyes were red-rimmed from crying. "Get out," she said without looking up. "Not until we discuss what happened last night." "What's to discuss?" Vivian finally met his eyes, her gaze defiant despite her obvious exhaustion. "I embarrassed you. I damaged your precious reputation." I failed to live up to the sterling example of Hartwell family values. Marcus dismissed Sophia with a look, waiting until they were alone before sitting across from Vivian. What I want to discuss is why my wife felt the need to get into a bar fight instead of coming home to deal with whatever was bothering her. Your wife? Vivian's laugh was bitter. When exactly did I become your wife, Marcus? Because I must have missed that transformation. I thought I was just your expensive mistake. You're being dramatic. Am I? She stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Do you know what that woman said to me? The one I supposedly attacked? Marcus waited. She said I was pathetic, that everyone could see my husband couldn't stand me, that I was just another rich girl playing dress-up in a marriage that meant nothing. Vivian's voice cracked slightly. And you know what the worst part was? She was right. The pain in her voice hit Marcus like a physical blow. For the first time, he began to understand that her reckless behavior wasn't rebellion. It was escape. She was running from the same emptiness that kept him working 18-hour days, the same loneliness that had him listening for her footsteps in hallways she'd never visit. Vivian! No! She turned to face him, tears streaming down her face. You don't get to Vivian me now. You don't get to pretend you care when it's convenient for you. I've spent 6 months trying to be the perfect corporate wife, trying to make this work, trying to find some scrap of affection or respect or even basic human decency from you. And all I get is criticism and disappointment and the kind of polite indifference you'd show a houseplant. Marcus stared at her, stunned by the raw honesty of her words. In all their months of marriage, they'd never been this honest with each other. It was brutal and necessary and completely terrifying. I never asked for affection, he said quietly. Neither did I, Vivian replied. But I hoped for it anyway. God help me, I actually thought we might learn to care about each other, that this arrangement might become something real. The admission hung between them, vulnerable and heartbreaking. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a crack in the careful armor he'd built around his emotions. Maybe, he said slowly, we've both been trying to protect ourselves from the wrong thing. Vivian wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. What's that supposed to mean? Maybe we're so afraid of being hurt that we've made it impossible for anything good to happen. For a moment, hope flickered in her green eyes. Then her expression hardened again. Pretty words, Marcus. But words don't change anything. You still see me as a liability, and I still feel like a prisoner in my own life. Marcus stood, moving closer to her. Then maybe it's time we both stopped running. I don't know how, Vivian whispered. Neither do I, Marcus admitted. But I'm tired of being angry all the time. Aren't you? Vivian looked at him for a long moment, seeing something in his face that hadn't been there before. Uncertainty, maybe even vulnerability. It wasn't much, but it was real. I can't go back to the way things were, she said finally. Good, Marcus replied, because I don't think either of us can survive it. They stood in Sophia's living room, surrounded by the wreckage of their first 6 months of marriage, and for the first time since their wedding day, both wondered if there might be a way forward that didn't require them to destroy each other in the process. Chapter 6. Unexpected Vulnerability. Vivian returned to the estate the following afternoon, her overnight bag clutched in white-knuckled hands as she stood in the marble foyer that had never felt less like home. The photographers had finally dispersed, but their absence only emphasized the hollow quiet that had settled over the house like dust. Marcus emerged from his study, still wearing yesterday's shirt with the sleeves rolled up, a sign of disorder that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. They regarded each other across the expanse of polished marble, two people who had shared a bed exactly once, their wedding night, and even then only for appearances, but had never truly seen each other until now. Mrs. Chen prepared lunch, Marcus said finally. If you're hungry. It was such a mundane offer, so carefully neutral, that Vivian almost smiled. That would be nice. They ate in the smaller dining room, the one with windows overlooking the winter garden, where bare branches created intricate shadows against the snow. The silence wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the quiet of two people trying to figure out how to exist in the same space without armor. The board meeting went well, Marcus said eventually, cutting his sandwich with surgical precision. The Morrison contract was salvaged. I'm glad. Vivian meant it, though she couldn't have explained why his business success mattered to her. You worked hard on that one. Marcus looked up, surprised. You knew about the Morrison contract? Mrs. Chen mentioned you'd been stressed about it, and you had those calls at all hours last week. Vivian shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. I noticed things. The revelation that she'd been paying attention to his work, to his stress levels, to the details of his life that he assumed she found boring, shifted something in Marcus's chest. How many other things had she noticed that he'd never given her credit for? I didn't realize you... That is, I thought you weren't interested in the business side of things. I'm not interested in quarterly reports and shipping manifestos, Vivian said carefully. But I'm interested in things that matter to you. Or I was, before we both decided to stop trying. The admission hung between them, fragile and honest. Marcus set down his fork, studying his wife's face as if seeing it clearly for the first time. Without the perfect makeup and designer armor, Vivian looked younger, more real. The small scar above her left eyebrow that he'd never noticed before. The way she bit her lower lip when she was thinking. These details felt more intimate than anything they'd shared in their marriage bed. I don't know how to do this, Marcus said suddenly. This, talking, being honest. I was raised to think that showing vulnerability was a sign of weakness. And I was raised to think that needing anyone was a character flaw, Vivian replied. We're quite a pair. Yes, Marcus said quietly, we are. That evening, they found themselves in Marcus's study, not by design, but because Vivian had been looking for a book and Marcus had been reviewing contracts, and somehow their separate activities had converged in the same space. Vivian curled up in the leather reading chair by the window with a worn copy of Jane Austen, while Marcus worked at his desk, occasionally glancing up to watch the way the lamplight caught the auburn highlights in her hair. Can I ask you something? Vivian said during one of these stolen glances. Marcus set aside his pen. Of course. That night at Le Bernardin, you said you wanted to build something lasting. What did you mean? The question caught him off guard. Marcus had been so focused on salvaging their present that he'd forgotten about the future he'd once imagined. I used to think it meant expanding the business, creating a legacy that would outlast me. But lately I've wondered if legacy is just another word for loneliness, if there's no one to share it with. He looked directly at her. What about you? That night, you said you wanted someone to choose you. Do you still believe that's possible? Vivian closed her book, her finger marking her place. I used to think love was this grand, overwhelming thing, like in the movies, thunderbolts and dramatic declarations. But watching my parents' marriage fall apart, seeing my friends divorce after passionate courtships, she paused, gathering her thoughts. Maybe I was looking for the wrong thing. What would be the right thing? Partnership, maybe. Respect. Someone who sees me as I actually am, instead of who they want me to be. Her green eyes met his. Someone who chooses to stay, even when it's difficult. The words hit Marcus with unexpected force. When was the last time someone had chosen to stay with him when things got difficult? His business associates tolerated his demanding nature because he made them money. His family had arranged this marriage because it served their interests. But Vivian, despite everything, despite his coldness and her rebellion, was here, trying to find a way forward. I've been thinking about what you said, Marcus said, about me treating you like expensive furniture. Vivian winced. That was harsh. I was angry. It was also accurate. Marcus left his desk, moving to sit on the sofa across from her chair. I married you because I needed a wife, to complete the picture of success I was supposed to project. But somewhere in these past few months, you stopped being a requirement and started being, I'm not sure what to call it. What do you mean? Marcus struggled to find words for feelings he'd never allowed himself to examine. When I read about the nightclub incident, my first thought wasn't about the publicity damage or what the board would think. It was about whether you were hurt, whether you were safe. And I couldn't understand why that mattered to me so much. Vivian's breath caught. It was the closest thing to an admission of caring that Marcus had ever offered, and it was more precious to her than any of the expensive gifts he'd given her out of obligation. I used to hate coming home, she said softly. This house felt like a beautiful prison, and you felt like my warden. But these past few days, thinking about never seeing you again, it scared me more than staying scared me. Why? Because despite everything, despite the fights and the loneliness and the way we've hurt each other, you're the only person who's never wanted to change me into someone else. You've been frustrated with my choices, but you've never tried to make me into a different person entirely. Marcus considered this. I suppose I always assumed you were exactly who you wanted to be. And I assumed you were exactly who you had to be. Vivian smiled sadly. We've spent so much time protecting ourselves from each other that we never learned who we actually were. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls lined with books that Marcus had collected but rarely had time to read. Outside, snow began to fall again, blanketing the estate grounds in pristine white that would be unmarked until morning. So where does that leave us? Marcus asked. I don't know, Vivian admitted. But for the first time since our wedding, I don't feel like we're enemies. No, Marcus agreed. We don't feel like enemies. It wasn't love. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it was something neither of them had expected to find in their arranged marriage. The possibility of genuine friendship. And perhaps, Marcus thought, as he watched Vivian return to her book, friendship might be a more solid foundation than passion anyway. For the first time in months, they shared the same space without counting the minutes until they could escape. It was a small victory, but it felt like the first step towards something that might eventually resemble a real marriage. Chapter 7. Growing Understanding. Spring arrived early that year, and with it, a gradual thawing that had nothing to do with the weather. Marcus and Vivian had settled into a new routine. Not quite friendship, not quite romance, but something warmer than the cold politeness that had defined their first months of marriage. They ate breakfast together now, sharing sections of the newspaper and commenting on the day's events with the careful consideration of people learning to trust each other. There's a new exhibition opening at the Whitney, Vivian mentioned one morning, glancing up from the arts section. Contemporary sculpture, some interesting pieces from emerging artists. Marcus looked up from his financial reports, coffee cup halfway to his lips. 3 months ago, he would have made some dismissive comment about modern art. Now he found himself saying, "Would you like to go? I could rearrange my afternoon meetings." Vivian's surprise was evident. "You want to go to an art gallery?" "I want to understand what you see in it," Marcus replied, and meant it. "You light up when you talk about art. I'd like to know why." The exhibition was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. Where he expected pretentious nonsense, he found Vivian's passionate explanations bringing the pieces to life. She moved through the gallery with infectious enthusiasm, stopping before a twisted metal sculpture that somehow conveyed both violence and beauty. "Look at the way the light catches here," she said, positioning Marcus at a specific angle. The artist is playing with the idea that destruction and creation are the same impulse, just viewed from different perspectives. Marcus studied the piece, trying to see what she saw. "It's angry," he said finally. "Yes, but look closer. What else?" He tilted his head, following the lines of bent metal, and suddenly understood. "It's reaching. The destroyed parts are reaching towards something." Vivian's smile was radiant. Exactly. It's about finding hope in devastation, about growing from the broken pieces. Standing there in the gallery, surrounded by art that challenged his assumptions about beauty and meaning, Marcus felt something shift inside him. This wasn't the frivolous party girl he'd married. This was a woman with depth, with passion, with an eye for beauty that he was only beginning to appreciate. "Thank you," he said as they walked home through Central Park, the late afternoon sun filtering through new leaves. "For what?" "For showing me something new. I can't remember the last time I looked at anything that didn't have a profit margin attached." Vivian laughed, but it was warm rather than mocking. "You're not as stuffy as you pretend to be, you know. When you let yourself actually experience things, instead of just analyzing them, you're quite insightful. Don't tell my board of directors. They think ruthless efficiency is my only redeeming quality. Maybe it's time they met the real Marcus Hartwell." The comment was casual, but it lingered with Marcus as they walked. When was the last time he'd been himself, truly himself with anyone? Even his sister Catherine only saw the composed businessman. Never the man who sometimes stood in his study at midnight, wondering if success was worth the isolation it required. Their growing friendship began to extend beyond shared meals and cultural outings. Vivian started spending time in Marcus's study while he worked, reading in the leather chair by the window or sketching in a notebook she'd started carrying. Her presence was surprisingly comforting. She didn't interrupt his concentration, but he found himself glancing up occasionally to find her absorbed in her book, a small frown of concentration creasing her brow. One evening, she looked up from her sketching to find him watching her. "What?" she asked, self-conscious. "You're different when you're creating," Marcus observed. "More yourself, I suppose." Vivian closed her notebook, curious. "What do you mean? When you're at social events, you perform. You're charming and vivacious and everything people expect you to be. But when you're drawing or looking at art or even just reading, that's when you seem most real." The observation was more perceptive than Vivian had expected, and it touched something tender inside her. "I've been performing for so long, sometimes I forget what's real and what's just for show." "I understand that," Marcus said quietly. The Marcus Hartwell the business world sees, composed, decisive, always in control, he's real, but he's not complete. There are parts of myself I haven't shared with anyone in years. "What parts?" Marcus hesitated, then made a decision that surprised them both. "I used to paint. Paint, watercolors, nothing professional, just... It helped me think, helped me process things." He looked almost embarrassed. "I haven't touched a brush in over a decade." Vivian set aside her notebook, giving him her full attention. "What did you like to paint?" "Seascapes, mostly. Ships, harbors, the way light moves on water. My grandfather used to take me sailing when I was young, and I loved watching the way everything changed, depending on the weather, the time of day." Marcus's voice grew wistful. "He said I had a good eye for capturing moments." "Why did you stop?" "College, business school, building the company. There wasn't time for hobbies that didn't contribute to the bottom line." Marcus shrugged, but Vivian could hear the regret in his voice. "My father said art was a luxury I couldn't afford if I wanted to be taken seriously." Vivian felt a familiar ache, the pain of dreams deferred for the sake of family expectations. "Do you miss it?" "I try not to think about it." "That's not the same thing." Marcus met her eyes, seeing understanding there instead of judgment. "Yes, I miss it more than I realized until just now." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of shared confession settling between them. Outside, rain began to patter against the windows, creating a cocoon of intimacy in the book-lined room. "I have paints," Vivian said suddenly. "Oils, acrylics, watercolors. I set up a studio in the morning room. I remember Mrs. Chen mentioned you'd claimed that space. You could paint with me sometime, if you wanted. No pressure, just if you wanted to remember what it felt like." The offer was tentative, careful not to push, But Marcus heard the genuine desire to share something meaningful. When was the last time someone had invited him to do something purely for the joy of it? "I'd like that," he said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. "Really?" "Really?" Vivian's smile was soft, pleased in a way that had nothing to do with social victory and everything to do with genuine connection. "Tomorrow afternoon? I'll set up by the windows where the light is best." "It's a date," Marcus said, then paused, hearing his own words. I know what you meant," Vivian said gently, but something in her eyes suggested that maybe, just maybe, it could be both. The next afternoon, Marcus found himself standing in Vivian's makeshift studio, a brush trembling slightly in his hand as he faced a blank canvas for the first time in 15 years. Vivian worked quietly beside him, occasionally offering gentle suggestions, but mostly just sharing the peaceful concentration that came with creating something purely for the joy of creation. When Marcus finally made his first tentative brushstroke, a simple line of blue that would become the horizon of a seascape he'd been carrying in his memory for decades, he felt a part of himself that he'd thought was lost forever suddenly stir back to life. And when Vivian smiled at him, her face lit with the kind of warm approval he'd never thought to want, Marcus began to understand that maybe their arranged marriage was becoming something neither of them had planned for. A chance to discover not just each other, but the parts of themselves they'd forgotten in the pursuit of other people's expectations. Chapter 8. Learning to Love. By late spring, the Hartwell estate had transformed from a beautiful mausoleum into something that almost resembled a home. The morning room, once a formal space used only for entertaining, had become their shared sanctuary. Canvases lined the windows, some finished, others half-completed experiments in color and light. The scent of turpentine and oil paint had replaced the sterile perfection of fresh flowers, and Marcus found he preferred it. Their afternoon painting sessions had become sacred time, a pocket of peace in their otherwise structured days. Marcus had rediscovered not just his love of watercolors, but a side of himself he'd forgotten existed, the man who could spend an hour perfecting the way sunlight danced on water, who found meditation in the gentle blend of blue and gray on canvas. "You're getting better," Vivian observed one afternoon, studying his latest seascape. "This one has real emotion in it." Marcus stepped back to look at his work with fresh eyes. She was right. Somewhere between the tentative brush strokes of his first attempts and this latest piece, he'd stopped thinking and started feeling. The painting captured not just a harbor scene, but a sense of longing, of being anchored yet yearning for open water. "I think I'm remembering why I loved this," he said, wiping paint from his hands. "It's the only time my mind is completely quiet." "That's what I love about creating anything," Vivian replied, adding a touch of gold to the abstract piece she'd been working on. "It's like meditation, but with color." They'd begun attending events together, not the obligatory business functions or charity galas, but things they actually wanted to experience. Gallery openings where Marcus asked thoughtful questions and Vivian watched him discover new artists with growing delight. Chamber music concerts where Vivian surprised him by knowing the composers and Marcus surprised her by actually enjoying the intimate atmosphere. "We should host something here," Vivian suggested one evening as they walked through their gardens, now bursting with spring blooms that she'd helped plan. Not a business dinner, but something fun, intimate. Marcus considered this. The estate had always been a showplace, never a gathering spot for genuine friendship. "What did you have in mind?" "A dinner party. Real people. Interesting conversation, good wine. Your sister Catherine, my friend Sophia, maybe some of the artists from the gallery." Vivian's eyes lit up as the idea took shape. "We could cook together, serve something we actually want to eat instead of what's expected." The suggestion was so unlike anything Marcus had ever considered that he almost dismissed it out of hand. But watching Vivian's enthusiasm, imagining their home filled with laughter and genuine warmth instead of polite obligation, He found himself nodding. "I'd like that," he said, and meant it. The dinner party was a revelation. 8 people gathered around the dining room table that had seen countless formal meals, but tonight felt relaxed, intimate. Catherine arrived with her new boyfriend, an environmental lawyer who made Marcus laugh despite himself. Sophia brought her latest gallery discovery, a sculptor whose work sparked passionate debate. David Morrison, the pediatric surgeon Vivian had once talked with until sunrise, attended with his wife, and Marcus found himself genuinely enjoying the man's stories about saving children's lives. Marcus had worried about being the odd man out in Vivian's artistic circle, but instead found himself at the center of animated discussions about everything from maritime law to the intersection of business ethics and creative expression. When David's wife asked about his own artwork, Vivian proudly led everyone to the morning room to see his latest seascape. "This is extraordinary," Catherine said, studying the painting with the critical eye of someone who'd grown up surrounded by art. "Marcus, I had no idea you were so talented." "Neither did I," Marcus admitted, glancing at Vivian. "I'd forgotten until recently." Later, as they cleaned dishes together in the kitchen, something Marcus had never done in his own home, Vivian watched him laugh at something Sophia had said about the sculptor's pretentious artist statement. "You're happy," she observed. Marcus paused in his dish drying, considering this. "I am. I don't think I realized how long it's been since I felt genuinely happy, instead of just satisfied with my accomplishments. What's the difference? Satisfaction is knowing you've done well at something important. Happiness is—" Marcus searched for the words. "Happiness is wanting to share the moment with someone else." Vivian felt something warm bloom in her chest at his words. When had she started wanting to share all her moments with Marcus? When had his opinions begun to matter more than anyone else's? When had the sound of his laughter become the best part of her day? "I've been thinking," Marcus said, hanging up the dish towel with the careful precision he brought to everything, "about what you said when we first married. About wanting someone to choose you." Vivian's pulse quickened. "What about it?" Marcus turned to face her fully, his gray eyes serious. "I want you to know that I choose you. Not because of our family's arrangement, not because of the business merger, but because you make me want to be a better version of myself." The words hit Vivian like a physical force. This was what she'd dreamed of, not grand romantic gestures, but simple, honest recognition of her worth as a person. "Marcus, I don't know if what we have is love," he continued, stepping closer. "I don't have enough experience with the emotion to be certain, but I know that I wake up looking forward to breakfast with you. I know that your laugh makes me forget about everything else. I know that when you're not here, the house feels empty in a way it never did before I knew what it felt like to share it with you." Vivian felt tears prick her eyes. "I choose you too," she whispered. "I choose the man who remembers to ask about my day, who listens when I talk about art, who trusted me enough to pick up a paintbrush again." She reached up to touch his face gently. "I choose the Marcus who exists when nobody else is watching." He covered her hand with his own, leaning into the touch. "When did this happen? When did we go from strangers to this?" "I think it happened gradually," Vivian said softly. "Like a painting one careful brushstroke at a time, until suddenly you step back and see the whole picture." Marcus smiled, the kind of genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his entire face. "And what do you see when you look at the whole picture?" "I see 2 people who found each other despite themselves," Vivian replied. "I see a partnership that's stronger than either of us expected. I see the possibility of something real and lasting and beautiful." When Marcus kissed her this time, it wasn't the polite, passionless kiss from their wedding day. It was tender and questioning, full of promise, and the kind of careful hope that comes from discovering something precious you hadn't known you were looking for. They stood in their kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of their first real dinner party, and realized that somewhere along the way, Their arranged marriage had become a choice they were both grateful to make every single day. Outside, their garden bloomed with flowers they'd planned together, and inside, their home felt warm with the kind of love that grows slowly, steadily, from friendship and respect, and the simple joy of discovering that the person you're bound to is also the person you'd choose, given all the options in the world. Chapter 9. New Challenges and Deeper Bonds. Summer brought unexpected challenges that tested their newfound happiness. The business press had begun speculating about Marcus's softened approach to negotiations, suggesting that married life had made him less ruthless. Several competitors attempted to exploit what they perceived as weakness, launching aggressive bids for contracts that had previously been Hartwell shippings by default. "They think love has made you weak," Vivian said one evening, finding Marcus hunched over financial reports in his study, stress evident in every line of his body. Marcus looked up, exhaustion etched in his features. "Maybe it has. 6 months ago, I would have crushed Morrison Industries without a second thought when they tried to undercut our Pacific route contracts. Instead, I spent 3 hours on the phone trying to find a solution that wouldn't put their employees out of work." "That's not weakness," Vivian said firmly, moving behind his chair to massage the tension from his shoulders. "That's evolution. You're still getting the contracts, aren't you? Most of them, but it's taking longer, costing more in legal fees and negotiations, and saving jobs, preserving relationships, building a reputation for fairness that will serve you for decades." Vivian's hands worked at the knots in his muscles, feeling them gradually relax under her touch. "Your father built an empire through intimidation. You're building something more sustainable." Marcus leaned back against her, drawing comfort from her warmth and certainty. "The board is asking questions. My father thinks I've lost my edge." "Your father built a successful company," Vivian said carefully, "but he also built a family where love was conditional on performance. Do you want to perpetuate that legacy?" The question hung in the air, simple but profound. Marcus thought of his childhood, of the constant pressure to prove himself worthy of affection, of the way his father's approval had always come with strings attached. Then he thought of the home he and Vivian were building together, where success was measured not just in profit margins, but in moments of genuine connection. "No," he said quietly, "I want to build something different." Their family's reactions to their obvious happiness created another layer of complexity. Eleanor Sterling watched her daughter's transformation with something between pride and bewilderment, unsure how to process a marriage that had evolved beyond mere convenience into genuine partnership. "You're glowing, darling," she observed during one of their weekly lunches. "Marriage clearly agrees with you." "It does," Vivian replied, unable to suppress her smile. "Marcus and I have found our rhythm." "I'm glad the arrangement worked out so well," Eleanor said, but there was something almost wistful in her tone. "Your father and I? We had something like that once, before the business consumed everything." Vivian studied her mother's carefully composed face, seeing past the perfect makeup to the woman who had once been young and hopeful. "It's not too late, you know, to find your way back to each other." Eleanor's laugh was brittle. "Oh, darling, some bridges burn too thoroughly to rebuild." The conversation haunted Vivian for days. She and Marcus had been lucky. They'd caught their marriage before bitterness and resentment could take root. But seeing her parents' elegant emptiness, she understood how easily their own story could have ended differently. Meanwhile, Charles Hartwell was having his own struggles with his son's transformation. The Marcus he'd raised was focused, driven, single-minded in his pursuit of success. This new version, the one who left meetings early to attend art galleries, who turned down profitable but ethically questionable deals, who seemed more interested in building a life than just expanding an empire, was unfamiliar territory. "Your quarterly numbers are down," Charles said during their monthly review meeting, his disappointment evident. "Our long-term prospects are up," Marcus countered. We've secured 3 new partnerships based on our reputation for fair dealing, and employee retention is at an all-time high. Employee retention doesn't impress shareholders. Sustainable growth does. And sustainable growth comes from building relationships, not just extracting maximum profit from every transaction. Charles studied his son with the calculating gaze that had intimidated business rivals for decades. Marriage has changed you. Yes, Marcus said simply, it has. I hope you don't come to regret it. The real test came in August, when a shipping accident in the Pacific threatened to become a public relations disaster. A Hartwell vessel had collided with a smaller craft during a storm, resulting in injuries and environmental damage. The legal department recommended the standard approach: minimize liability, settle quietly, control the narrative. Marcus chose a different path. We're going to take full responsibility, he announced during the crisis management meeting. We're going to cover all medical costs, fund the environmental cleanup, and implement new safety protocols across the entire fleet. Sir, the head of legal interrupted, that admission of liability could cost us millions in additional lawsuits, and hiding behind legal technicalities could cost us our reputation, Marcus replied. We do the right thing, and we do it publicly. The decision sent shockwaves through the business community. Competitors waited for Hartwell Shipping to be decimated by lawsuits and regulatory penalties. Instead, the company's transparent handling of the crisis earned praise from environmental groups, regulatory agencies, and industry publications. New clients, impressed by Marcus's integrity, began seeking them out. You were right, Vivian told him as they watched the sunset from their garden, a glass of wine in her hand and his head in her lap. Taking responsibility was the right choice. I couldn't have made it without you, Marcus said, reaching up to touch her face. A year ago, I would have been so afraid of appearing weak that I'd have missed the opportunity to actually be strong. You were always strong. You just needed to learn that strength doesn't require isolation. As summer faded into autumn, their marriage deepened in ways neither had anticipated. They had learned to fight constructively, to support each other's dreams, to build something together that was stronger than either could create alone. When industry publications started referring to Marcus as the new model of ethical leadership, he shared the credit with Vivian, understanding that her influence had been the catalyst for his evolution. Their love story was nothing like the fairy tales Vivian had once dreamed of. There were no dramatic declarations or grand gestures. Instead, it was built on morning conversations over coffee, shared glances across dinner parties, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that whatever challenges arose, they would face them together. When Vivian missed her period in late September, they were both ready for the next chapter of their unexpected love story. The pregnancy test sat on their bathroom counter like a tiny harbinger of the future, and as they waited for the results, Marcus took her hand. Whatever happens, he said, we're in this together. Vivian squeezed his fingers, marveling at how far they'd traveled from that first awkward dinner at Le Bernardin. Together, she agreed, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The test was positive, and their joy was immediate and shared, not because a baby was expected of them, but because they had created something beautiful from something that had started as mere obligation. Their child would be born into a home built on genuine love, raised by parents who had chosen each other not once but every day since that choice became possible. As they held each other in their bathroom, laughing and crying simultaneously, Marcus understood that his grandfather had been wrong about one thing. Sometimes the greatest legacy isn't built from duty, but from the courage to let duty evolve into something infinitely more precious. Chapter 10. Happy Ending. 2 years after their wedding, the Hartwell estate bore little resemblance to the pristine showplace it had once been. Children's toys scattered the marble foyer. Not just their own 6-month-old daughter Emma's rattles and stuffed animals, but the evidence of regular visits from friends and family who no longer viewed the house as a museum, but as a home where laughter echoed through rooms once reserved for formal occasions. Marcus emerged from his study to find Vivian in the morning room, now permanently converted to their shared studio, nursing Emma while adding finishing touches to a painting destined for her first solo exhibition next month. The sight still filled him with wonder. His wife, radiant in the afternoon light, their daughter contentedly settled against her chest, surrounded by the creative chaos they'd built together. "How are my girls?" he asked, settling into the chair beside them, his own paint-stained fingers reaching out to stroke Emma's dark hair. "Perfect," Vivian said, shifting Emma to her shoulder for burping. "Emma's been my most patient critic today. She only fussed when I mixed the colors wrong." Marcus laughed, taking their daughter and settling her against his chest with the practiced ease of hands that had learned to be gentle. Emma, with Vivian's green eyes and Marcus's stubborn chin, gazed up at her father with the serious expression that reminded them both of Marcus's childhood photographs. "The Morrison contract came through," Marcus said, gently bouncing Emma as she began to fuss. "They specifically requested us because of our environmental initiatives." "I'm proud of you," Vivian said, wiping paint from her hands. "Your father would never have prioritized environmental protection over profit margins." "My father is learning to adapt," Marcus replied with a smile. "He's actually started asking about sustainable shipping practices. Claims it's purely for competitive advantage, but I caught him reading about ocean conservation last week." The transformation of their families had been as gradual as their own evolution. Charles Hartwell, initially resistant to his son's softer approach to business, had grudgingly admitted that Marcus's reputation for integrity was attracting a new class of clientele companies willing to pay premium rates for ethical partnerships. Eleanor Sterling, witnessing her daughter's genuine happiness, had begun questioning her own choices, even tentatively accepting her husband's suggestion that they attend marriage counseling. "Sophia called," Vivian said, settling beside them on the couch that had replaced the formal furniture. "The gallery wants to extend your showing to 6 weeks. Apparently, your seascapes are becoming quite sought after." Marcus still marveled at this turn of events. His artwork, begun as personal rediscovery, had evolved into something that resonated with others. Art collectors who'd known him only as a ruthless businessman were now seeking paintings that revealed depths they'd never suspected existed. "I never imagined I'd have 2 careers," he said, watching Emma's eyes grow heavy with sleep. "You never imagined a lot of things that turned out to be the best parts of your life," Vivian observed, curling up against his free arm. It was true. Marcus had never imagined waking up eager to share his day with someone else, never imagined finding as much satisfaction in a perfectly mixed blue-green as in a successfully negotiated contract. He'd never imagined that love could be both peaceful and passionate, that partnership could feel like coming home to yourself. That evening, they hosted their monthly dinner party, a tradition that had grown from their first tentative gathering into something their friends actively anticipated. Catherine arrived with her environmental lawyer, now her fiancé, carrying news of their engagement. Sophia brought her latest gallery discovery, a young painter whose work reminded Marcus of his own early attempts. David and his wife came with stories from the Children's Hospital, where they'd established a new wing funded partly through Marcus's quietly arranged donation. As they gathered around the table that had once hosted only business dinners and formal occasions, Marcus looked around at the faces lit by candlelight and genuine affection. This was what legacy looked like, not just financial success or corporate expansion, but the creation of community, the fostering of relationships that enriched everyone involved. "A toast," Catherine said, raising her wine glass as dessert was served, "to Marcus and Vivian, who proved that arranged marriages can become love stories when both people are brave enough to be themselves. To choosing each other," Vivian added, her eyes meeting Marcus's across the table, "every single day." They drank to the toast, but Marcus found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them here. Two people who'd entered marriage as strangers, protecting themselves behind walls of duty and expectation, had somehow found the courage to become vulnerable, to become real, to become partners in the truest sense. Later, after their guests had gone and Emma was sleeping peacefully in her nursery, Marcus and Vivian walked through their gardens hand in hand. The autumn air was crisp with the promise of winter, but the gardens Vivian had redesigned bloomed with late-season flowers that would provide beauty even in the colder months. "Do you ever regret it?" Vivian asked as they paused beside the fountain where moonlight danced on water. "The arrangement that brought us together? Do you ever wonder what might have happened if we'd been free to choose from the beginning?" Marcus considered the question seriously, as he did all of Vivian's inquiries. "I think we needed the arrangement," he said finally. "Left to our own devices, I would have chosen someone safe and predictable, someone who wouldn't challenge me to grow. You would have chosen someone passionate and romantic, someone who might have loved the idea of you more than the reality. And instead, we were forced to discover who we actually were underneath all our assumptions about what we wanted." Marcus turned to face her fully, his hands framing her face in the moonlight. "I wouldn't change anything about our story, Vivian. Even the difficult parts brought us here." She smiled, the kind of radiant, unguarded smile that had first made him wonder what it would be like to be the cause of such joy. "I love you, Marcus Hartwell. Not the man you thought you had to be, but the man you chose to become." "I love you too," he replied, the words as natural as breathing now, though they'd taken months to learn to say. "I love the woman who saw potential in an arranged marriage, who had the courage to be vulnerable with a stranger, who taught me that strength and gentleness aren't opposites, but partners." As they kissed in their garden, surrounded by the life they'd built together, both Marcus and Vivian understood that they'd gotten something far more precious than what either had originally wanted. They'd found not just love, but the kind of partnership that made them both better versions of themselves. Their daughter slept peacefully in a house filled with laughter and creativity, destined to grow up, understanding that love wasn't just passion or convenience, but the daily choice to support, challenge, and cherish the person beside you. She would learn that the best marriages weren't perfect, but were built by two imperfect people who decided that their shared life was worth the work of becoming better together. The Gilded Arrangement had become something infinitely more valuable than gold, a love story built on friendship, respect, and the radical act of choosing each other not once but every day for the rest of their lives. And in the quiet of their garden, under stars that had witnessed countless beginnings, Marcus and Vivian Hartwell held each other and marveled at the beautiful life they'd created from the courage to let duty become devotion, obligation become affection, and an arrangement of convenience become the greatest love story either had ever known.